The West Memphis Three does not refer to the three 8-year-old boys that were found mutilated and downed in the woods. Instead, it refers to the 3 teenage boys that were arrested for the worst child murders ever to happen in the state of Arkansas. This is the tale of 3 murdered babies and the 3 teenagers that got caught up in the satanic panic that clouded the judgment of everyone, including the police, that resides in the Bible Belt. A case of corrupt police, the torture of a mentally disabled boy, small town gossip, and how wearing black put 3 kids on death row without a shred of evidence. Here's the story of the West Memphis Three. Let's get into it. On the 6th of May 1993, the community of West Memphis, Arkansas heard the news that they'd been dreading for the past 24 hours. The bodies of 3 8-year-old boys, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were found in a drainage canal out on Robin Hood Hills, close to where they were last seen playing with their bikes. All of the boys were nude, their hands and feet hogtied behind their backs with their own shoelaces. They'd been wrapped in plain white sheets and weighed down in the creek in an attempt to keep them below the surface. All 3 were beaten with multiple objects, possibly branches found in the creek, leading investigators to believe that there were more than one assailant. Michael and Steve were beaten and drowned. Stevie's beating was the most severe, and most of it was centered on his face. But Christopher had endured the worst torture of all. He'd been beaten, cut, and castrated. The missing body parts were never recovered. The only physical pieces of evidence found at the scene was a single drop of blue candle wax, 2 hairs, and fibers on 2 of the boys' bodies. The fibers were a mix of polyester, rayon, and cotton, a combination used in almost every kind of commercial clothing manufacturing. The majority of t-shirts, dresses, pants, and even bed sheets are made from it. The fibers could just as well have belonged to the 3 victims themselves as it could have the killer, or just about any of their homes. One of the hairs was found on a tree, belonging to a white individual. The other was found on one of the sheets wrapped around one of the children and came from a person of African descent. Stevie's mother immediately asked police if they'd found Stevie's pocket knife. It was a gift from his grandfather, and he never left home without it. He cherished that little blade with every ounce of his being, but the knife was never found. Remember that detail. It's going to come up again later. The brutal nature of the crime, the terrible tragedy that 3 8-year-old boys were torn from this earth in such a horrific way. West Memphis and the whole of Arkansas were demanding revenge for their slain babies. From the moment this discovery was made, there was no option other than complete and utter annihilation for whoever did this. This was a witch hunt before the tiny bodies were even cold. And speaking of witches, West Memphis had plenty of stories about dark rituals and devil worship going on in the woods at night, and had those tales for decades. But what did you expect? A small town with wild, dark woods and a whole lot of boredom is going to start generating this kind of thing without a story needing any truth to base it all off of. Add to that the fact that these murders happened right at the tail end of the satanic panic that had gripped the nation for more than a decade. What with all of those drugs, violent movies, and video games indoctrinating teenagers into praying to Satan. It didn't help that that part of town was very poor, crime was high, drug use was pretty common, and it had its fair share of child troublemakers running around with minimal supervision, naughty teens that ran around doing anything in their power to impress pretty girls with shock and danger. This was the kind of atmosphere that West Memphis, and by extension the police force, were in the middle of. Then, a random arrest just allowed the already boiling community into a full-blown hysteria. A woman named Vicki Hutcherson was arrested for credit card fraud and just happened to be arrested, and she brought her 8-year-old son, Aaron, with her to the police station a few days after the murders. Aaron, a 2nd grader with a wild imagination, spilled a fantastical, outrageous tale to a police officer that was watching him while Vicki went in for her interrogation about the fraud charges. He knew the 3 murdered boys. Actually, they played together there often, and sometimes they watched a group of men who spoke Spanish and sang songs to the devil having sex with each other. Yeah, you didn't mishear that at all. This kid said that he and the 3 dead boys watched a group of devil worshippers engage in strange sexual rituals together back in that haunted forest. And now it's about to get even stranger, if you can believe that. Not only did police take this outrageous account very seriously, they continued to hang on to Aaron's every word when he started adding more and more new details every day. He said he'd been present when the murders occurred, but managed to escape. But that couldn't possibly be true, because during the time that they were being murdered, Aaron was being babysat by a family member in a different neighborhood. It didn't help that his story was playing right into police's theories. They immediately jumped onto the idea that the killings were done in a ritualistic fashion right from the start. The knots used to tie the boys up was unusual. The sexual assault, missing sexual organs, and the fact that they were children, to the authorities, just as knee-deep into the spooky tales of this town, this just had to be devil worship. And then Aaron's mother, Vicky, jumped into the fold with her own insane account of meeting 3 teenage devil worshippers. Before we get into Vicky's tale, keep in mind that there's not a single shred of proof to corroborate her story. With that said, Vicky recalled that after the murders, she suspected that a local goth kid, 18-year-old Damien Echols, who wore black and had an open interest in the occult, must somehow be involved with this secret cult in the woods. She approached one of Damien's friends, who just happened to be her neighbor in the trailer park, and convinced the boy to introduce her to Damien under the pretenses that she was interested in witchcraft too. The neighbor's name was Jessie Misskelley, a mentally challenged 17-year-old whose IQ was somewhere around 70. Vicky then recalled that Damien took her and Jessie to a ritual performed in the woods at midnight, where there were 10 other cult members present too, all of them teenagers. When a wild orgy broke out, Vicky decided that it was too much for her and she left. Conveniently, she couldn't identify any of the cult members other than Jessie and Damien. Poor Jessie was hauled in with promises of receiving the $35,000 reward money if he had information. Instead, investigators pounced on an intellectually challenged boy who could barely read. To call this a coerced confession would be an understatement. Jessie was near hysterics by the time they dragged him in for a polygraph that Jessie promptly failed because his heart was beating out of his chest with fear. I despise polygraphs and everything about them. They aren't just wildly inaccurate, their results aren't applicable in court at all. It's simply a tool to bully and coerce suspects into a state of absolute terror, and that's exactly what they achieved with Jessie. When they told him he failed the test, that he killed the boys, that he was some kind of satanist, Jessie's mind completely fractured. He just agreed to everything the officers suggested to him. Not only did he admit to seeing the children being beaten by Damien, but he even agreed that when they mentioned another of Damien's friends, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, was involved in the crime too. Jessie said he left the stream when the beatings turned into torture, and one of the boys was dead and he didn't see the rest of what Damien and Jason did to the kids. Funny thing though, Jessie couldn't seem to recall what the boys were wearing. He claimed that Christopher Byers was strangled to death by Damien when the older boy placed a stick over his neck and pressed down on it. Yet, Christopher had no injuries consistent with any kind of strangulation. He remembered them being tied with brown rope when they were tied with their own white shoelaces. He got the location completely wrong, and the time that the attack happened was off by hours. All of the second graders and the teenagers in question, except for Jessie, were in school when Jessie said the murder happened. So apparently, based on the complete fabrications of a crazy woman, her deeply traumatized young son, and a mentally challenged teenager who endured a torturous interrogation with no lawyer or even his parents present, Jessie, Damien, and Jason were arrested on 3 counts of murder. Jessie had long since dropped out of school. Due to his understandably terrible grades, and his very poor family couldn't afford a better education or specialized care for him. Damien was a troublemaker who'd been arrested for shoplifting and theft. He dropped out of school. He fought constantly with his parents, and his friends all reported that he liked starting fires. Damien wore pentagrams around his neck, collected books on the occult and demonology, and listened to Slayer. He'd been institutionalized for a mental illness that caused auditory and visual hallucinations and extreme mood swings. But his mental state didn't improve upon release. His fascination with the occult and strange behavior just accelerated. His family, like Jason and Jessie's, were impoverished and they just couldn't afford the appropriate medicine and therapy for him. Damien was headed on a very dangerous path that no one can deny. But the fact of the matter is, he hadn't been receiving the proper medical care. His home life was questionable at best, and he'd never shown any signs of extreme violence outside of a few schoolyard fights, which, let's be honest, wasn't all that unusual in the neighborhood that they came from. Only Jason was an outlier. Outside of one shoplifting incident, he did very well in school and had a talent for art. But police decided that no stable boy would hang out with delinquents like Damien and Jessie, so there must be something wrong with him too. During their investigation into the boys, several people placed Jessie in the trailer park where he lived. Damien and Jason were together the afternoon, and Damien even spoke to a few girls over the phone, but wasn't speaking to anyone at the time that the murders occurred. So they couldn't definitively be placed. The pond behind Damien's house was searched. At the bottom was a survival-style knife that could have been the blade that left the cuts on the boys. Their injuries were consistent with a knife that had a serrated edge, which this one had. There was no blood or fibers on it and no way to prove that it belonged to Damien, but it was taken as evidence nonetheless. A blue candle was found in Damien's girlfriend's house that police decreed was a match to the single drop of blue wax found in the forest. But years later, it was proven that the color was actually not a match at all. Both were blue, but they were of completely different shades. Not that that stopped police from submitting it as evidence. It was decided that Damien was the ringleader, Jason was his budding Satanist protege, and Jessie was the feeble-minded trailer park delinquent whose upbringing caused him to naturally accept violence. Of all of the kids, I feel the worst for Jessie in all of this. Seeing that defeated boy with towering guards around him is absolutely heartbreaking. Jessie had no chance against the bastards that forced him to be there. He was completely taken advantage of by a police department that was so desperate to make an arrest that they were willing to torture a mentally handicapped boy to pin this whole terrible triple child murder onto. This has to be the most disgusting behavior from a police department that I've ever had to research. The media storm that followed was an absolute nightmare. The three suspected killers' faces were plastered on every newsroom, TV talk show, and every newspaper across the United States. The boys' families were horribly harassed. The amount of threatening phone calls they received forced them to disconnect their phones. They were screamed at in public, and many of them lost their jobs because reporters kept turning up to interview them. Jessie was allowed a defense attorney only after his arrest. His name was Dan Stidham, and Dan was horrified when he got his hands on the recordings of the interrogations. Besides a dozen human rights violations being committed, none of Jessie's confused and frightened ramblings were accurate to the actual murders at all. Finally, someone enters the fold with some sense. It doesn't require a genius to realize that every single word out of Jessie's mouth was clearly being egged on and suggested. The hair samples that were collected at the scene weren't even brought out at all. Vicky took the stand. What, did you think this piece of work was going to let down on the elaborate lie now? She retold the story of the gathering of occultists and added that Damien had admitted to her that he killed the children one night when he'd had too much to drink. There was no evidence of Damien's confession or any ritual that ever took place. She was conveniently never officially charged with the fraud charges in exchange for her testimony. Oh, but it gets worse. Every member of the jury was aware of the case, and every single one of them wanted to watch the boys burn just like the rest of Memphis. They decreed all three teenagers guilty, despite the fact that there wasn't a shred of physical evidence to prove it, except for a clearly coerced confession from a boy who was very obviously not mentally fit to be a reliable source. And let's not forget that Dan Stidham absolutely destroyed that confession, totally ripped it apart, pointed out all of the inaccuracies, and had experts on the stand to testify that Jessie was the perfect vessel for suggestion. Prejudice and public pressure within the Bible Belt made the decision for the jury. Jessie's trial wrapped up first, and he'd end up getting the lowest sentence of all, 40 years for 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. Jessie was further influenced behind the scenes, again, without his attorney present. Prison guards told him that if he'd confess and testify against his friends, he'd receive a reduced sentence. This set off a slew of new confessions, each one with new details added. He started talking about seances that Damien made them do together in the woods and said that Damien stalked the victims for weeks before the murders, that they'd been drinking whiskey that day. Of his 5 official confessions behind bars, each more frantic than the next, every single one of them contradicted the other. Yet, several residents of the trailer park where Jessie lived testified that he'd been in the trailer park all day. He'd even talked to several of them. Jessie was losing his mind completely and he desperately needed professional help. Not that he was getting any. Jason got life and Damien was sentenced to death. But this isn't where this story ends, because the boys had Dan Stidham in their corner. He wasn't just sure of their innocence, he was burning with rage for their terrible treatment, obvious corruption, and the multitude of shortcuts from police and their willingness to pin this heinous crime on 3 teenagers just so they could close a case. Not to mention their blatant bribery of Vicky, letting her off scot-free for a crime in exchange for lying for them. Dan was going to get justice for his clients, even if it meant sinking his entire career behind it. And he wasn't the only one. The entire trial was televised, and the rest of America weren't as easily swayed by an occult expert with no qualifications behind him on the stand as people outside of the deeply superstitious people living in the Bible Belt were. They saw the gaping holes in the case, and an entire movement sprung up to help fund a retrial for the accused. Now bear with me for a second here, because the trickle of new evidence that came out after their convictions, thanks to continuous public support and Dan's relentless pursuit of the case, took years to come to a head. First, in '96, a new forensic team took over the autopsy photos and found bite marks on the children's faces, human bite marks. Damien, Jessie, and Jason's dental impressions did not match the bite marks. Then there's 2 of the murdered boys' fathers who were highly suspicious but were never looked into by police at all. John Byers, Christopher Byers' adoptive father, was a strange character. He got up to all sorts of theatrics for the cameras, like starting fires in the forest and yelling at the heavens that he was cleansing the earth of the sins that the accused had committed there. He handed a pocket knife to a reporter in a dramatic show of camaraderie, announcing that it was brand new, never used, and it was his gift to the journalist. The reporter found blood on the knife. That blood was matched to John Byers and his adopted son Christopher. John claimed to have cut himself with the knife while dressing a deer. His wife, Melissa, later died in bed while lying next to her husband, and coroners couldn't determine how she died. John Byers' teeth did not match the bite marks either, so it wasn't him. But that doesn't change the fact that he definitely wasn't a very stable individual. Stevie Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, also had ties to the crime scene. The shoelaces that were used to tie the boys up were re-examined, and they found that it had DNA on them that partially matched Terry. The hair that was found on a tree was looked at again too. That hair partially matched to a man named David Jacobs, a close friend of Terry. The 2 were confirmed to be together during the time that the murders would have occurred, but outside of admitting that they were together, they had no alibi to prove where they were that afternoon. These 2 pieces of DNA did not match the 3 convicted of the crime, yet they only partially matched Terry Hobbs and David Jacobs. Not exactly a smoking gun, but close enough to make it highly probable that they'd been at Robin Hood Creek that day, or at the very least, touched the shoelaces. 3 witness reports that were buried back in '93 resurfaced, where Terry was seen with his stepson and his 2 little friends that afternoon. Yet Terry denied having seen them that day at all, despite 3 separate people being certain that he was with the boys. Terry's sister-in-law reported seeing Terry doing laundry on the night that the searches were going on. He was not out there looking for his missing son. Apparently washing his clothes, and curtains and sheets from Stevie's room was a much more pressing matter than his son's well-being at that very moment. His own daughter accused her father of molesting her and her stepbrother, Stevie, when they were little. He'd been charged with shooting his own brother a year after the murders. The brother stepped in to save Terry's wife and Stevie's mother, Pam, when Terry attacked her, resulting in Terry whipping out a firearm. Apparently, Terry was abusive toward Pam and the children throughout their marriage. Then Pam made a disturbing discovery. 10 years after the murders and long before the new information was released, Pam was sorting through one of Terry's drawers and found a wooden box with little Stevie's pocket knife inside. Remember the knife that Stevie's mother specifically asked for when their remains were discovered? Yep, it was that exact knife. Terry backtracked and said he'd confiscated the knife from Stevie a few days before the murders. A year later, in 2004, they got divorced, and Pam's never been happy with any of the explanations that her ex-husband had for having the knife. Then, in 2019, Terry vanished off the face of the earth and no one knows where he is. Pam never believed that the three teenagers killed Stevie and his friends. She's been supportive of a retrial since the day that they were convicted. John Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, has been very vocal in his beliefs that Terry killed the boys too. But forgive me if I don't take him and his forest-burning rants too seriously. I do believe Pam is of a sound and logical mind though, and Terry Hobbs sounds like he was a scary, scary man. Stevie was beaten terribly around his face to the point that he was unrecognizable, making this a much more personal attack. And then there's the laundry that Terry insisted on doing, including bedding from Stevie's room. If you recall, the boys were wrapped in sheets before being submerged. In 2009, Vicki Hutchison openly admitted that everything she'd said on the stand was a complete fabrication. According to her, the police threatened to have her son taken away from her if she didn't cooperate with them. The day after the bodies were discovered, they'd already decided who they wanted to take down for it, and one of them just happened to live a few houses down from Vicki's trailer. On that first visit to the station for the interrogation revolving around her fraud charges, they put her in a room that had photographs of Damien, Jessie, and Jason on the wall that they were using as dart targets. I'm a little torn about how I feel about Vicki's recantation. I'm certain she lied back then, but that makes her even more untrustworthy. But I can see how Vicki and her son being dragged into a room where teenage devil worshippers with darts in their pictures could incite an 8-year-old boy into a wild fantasy to please the officers that were threatening to take him away from his mommy. Conveniently, most of Vicki's interrogation notes just went mysteriously missing, and that's a detail that I feel gives her more credence. A corrupt station that was threatening a single mother would definitely make that affidavit disappear. And then there's the other suspects that were never even looked into. Just like Terry Hobbs and David Jacobs were discarded immediately, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland, both teenagers with a long list of drug offenses, had abruptly left town 4 days after the murders. They failed polygraphs, not that that means much to me anyway, and Morgan admitted that he might have killed the boys during a blackout and just didn't remember it, a regular occurrence with his heavy drug abuse. But he recanted his confession almost as soon as he said it, and they were both let loose so that the investigation could focus on Jason, Jessie, and Damien instead. Morgan and Holland aren't great suspects, to be honest, and I personally think that they were picked up with the same intention of pinning the crime on a devil-worshipping kid who fit the narrative that the police were going for from the very start. There was another man reported by a gas station nearby. He was described as a tall black male, completely disoriented and bleeding from multiple wounds. The staff assumed that he was a drug addict or a bum that had gotten into a fight. Police never arrived when they called to have the man removed because most of their people were out searching for the missing children at that moment. But they did come around the next day to find a bathroom covered in blood. The seemingly intoxicated man had woken up and left by then. Again, not a great suspect. If he was so intoxicated that he could barely stand up straight, I doubt he'd have been able to control 3 children, tie them up in intricate knots, assault, kill, and submerge them with sheets and rocks. But it needs to be mentioned that the police didn't even bother to follow up on a suspicious suspect. And finally, several people have bought the survival knife found in the pond behind Damien's house. Okay, so I need to rewind a little here. Remember the bite wound above Stevie Branch's eyebrow? The coroner's report labeled it as a bite mark back when the case first went to trial. But since then, forensics have taken a look at the photos again and decided that unless a young child was the one doing the biting, it would be too small to be from an adult's mouth. What it did match was the butt end of the survival knife found behind Damien's house. The mark on Stevie's head was exactly 30 millimeters in circumference. The knife's end is 29.8 millimeters wide and fits into that circular wound perfectly. There's a little bit of give in human skin, accounting for that 0.2 millimeters, making it as close to a definitive match as you could ask for in a surface skin wound. This find isn't making Damien's innocence look all that great, I'll admit, but there's no proof that the knife belonged to Damien outside of it being found in a neighborhood he happened to live in. In 2010, the accused were granted a retrial after 18 years behind bars, where all of it was spent on death row for Damien. The day had finally come, and this time both sides had legal teams that only Hollywood characters could afford. Damien, Jason, and Jessie's plight had reached the nation, and thanks to donations, they were able to afford a great deal more resources. Arkansas knew that they were screwed. If the three of them were found innocent, it would cost the state millions upon millions of dollars in compensation, not just for the convicted, but also to their families who lost jobs because of it all, the murdered boys' families, and possibly Vicky and her son too. So instead of going through with a full-blown trial, the state of Arkansas offered them an afford deal. Basically what this is an acceptance of the original guilty verdict while still retaining your profession of innocence. So the three would walk free, but will always have the murder charges on their records. They could collect evidence and appeal the case from the outside if they wanted to, but that would put the death penalty on the table all over again. They all took the deal, and I don't blame them. We can sit here and demand that the courts look at the case all over again, shake our fists at the screen, and call them cowards, but they'd been living this hell for 2 decades now. I'd want it to be over too. And like Jason pointed out, it didn't feel like justice. There was still someone out there who'd killed 3 little boys, but Damien was still on death row. His best friend's life was on the line, and he'd happily swallow the bitter taste of the deal in his mouth so that his friend could live. Damien authored several books, some about his time in prison, others on the spiritual practices that helped keep his fragile mental disorder manageable while he was behind bars, and another on meeting his wife. He's still rocking the black attire and listens to heavy metal. All 3 of them are very vocal advocates about bringing the DNA back to the lab to test it against CODIS and all of the other suspects, including finding Terry Hobbs or at least comparing it to his living relative's DNA. Damien and Jason don't blame Jessie for his confessions. They've made it quite clear that the system took advantage of a kid who was not mentally fit to be put through the torture that he was put through. I don't believe that they did it either. The 2 hairs and the DNA on the shoelaces were the only biological evidence found at the scene, yet it matches none of them. Jessie had an alibi, several of them, throwing this entire story out the window if the 3 of them weren't together that afternoon. The knife from the pond and the wound on Stevie's head is weird, I'll admit that. I don't think it was a bite mark either. But there are a billion other objects that could have caused this damage other than a pretty common knife that can't be proven to belong to Damien. Outside of suffering from a mental illness that was going completely untreated and an unhealthy obsession with all things dark and menacing, Damien certainly wasn't running around the woods with decapitated chickens and dancing around green fires. He was weird, but I just don't think he was a killer. Jessie and Jason definitely weren't either. Jessie didn't have the mental chops to leave a crime scene that clean, and Jason had no prior concerning behaviors that indicated that he'd killed little children. Not to mention that all 3 of them were actively fighting to have the DNA and all of the evidence looked at again with better technology. If they wanted to hide something, I doubt that they'd be putting more attention on the evidence that could prove their guilt. Terry Hobbs and possibly David Jacobs, well, that's another matter entirely. Terry was a terrible human being. The molestation of his children can't be proven, but he definitely beat his wife and kids, and he shot his own brother. He assaulted a neighbor in the 80s and was generally known to be a volatile man. If I were going to look into anyone, it'd be Terry Hobbs. Unfortunately, he's in the wind for now. But if it's him, it won't be for long. Just this year, 2025, the Supreme Court granted the re-examination of all the evidence and to have everything, including the DNA, run through testing again. So, for the foreseeable future, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But maybe you have other theories than I do. You know how much I appreciate your opinions. Drop them in the comments section below. And while you're at it, don't forget to leave a like and to subscribe so you don't miss an upload. See you in the next one. Cheers.